28. We're going to look at the last section of verses 31 through 43. You shall make the robe of the ephod all of blue. There shall be an opening at its top. In the middle of it, around its opening, there shall be a binding of woven work like the opening of a coat of mail, so that it will not be torn. You shall make on its hem pomegranates of blue and purple and scarlet material all around on its hem, and bells of gold between them all around. A golden bell and a pomegranate, a golden bell and a pomegranate, all around on the hem of the robe. It shall be on Aaron when he ministers, and its tinkling shall be heard when he enters and leaves the holy place before the Lord, so that he will not die. You shall also make a plate of pure gold, and shall engrave on it, like the engravings of a seal, holy to the Lord. You shall fasten it on a blue cord, and it shall be on the turban. It shall be at the front of the turban. It shall be on Aaron's forehead, and Aaron shall take away the iniquity of the holy things which the sons of Israel consecrate with regard to all their holy gifts, and it shall always be on his forehead, that they may be accepted before the Lord. You shall weave the tunic of checkered work of fine linen, and shall make a turban of fine linen, and you shall make a sash, the work of a weaver. For Aaron's sons you shall make tunics, you shall also make sashes for them, and you shall make caps for them, for glory and for beauty. You shall put them on Aaron your brother, and on his sons with him, and you shall anoint them and ordain them and consecrate them, that they may serve me as priests. You shall make for them linen breeches to cover their bare flesh. They shall reach from the loins even to the thighs. They shall be on Aaron and on his sons when they enter their tent of meeting, or when they approach the altar to minister in the holy place, so that they do not incur guilt and die. It shall be a statute forever to him and to his descendants after him. Okay, what do we think about that? The sartorial splendor of the priesthood.
So evidently they didn't wear any underclothing.
Probably, it sounds like probably not on a regular basis anyway.
They had
Boxer briefs, it sounds like. Yeah.
If this is not done, there are some consequences from death to being tested by the Lord. It's kind of similar to you not just do this or else. There is a penalty.
Mm-hmm.
The language that follows this real clear.
Well, it's kind of maybe hard for us to envision some of it, but they were instructed and they knew, and this is very serious business. In fact, the robe had the bells on it, so that when he was back in the Holy of Holies and nobody could see him, they could hear him moving around, and they knew he hadn't died, which meant that his sacrifice was acceptable. And if it was not acceptable, if he forgot his undies or something like that when he went in, well, they wouldn't be hearing any tinkling going on in the holy place, and that's kind of an odd turn of a phrase there. But that's so it's an ornate thing. The golden bells are ornate, but they'd have a very practical purpose. Maybe the most practical thing of the whole. The not really symbolic at all, just to let you know, come get your guy if you don't hear anything, because he's dead. So, what's that, Ken?
It's funny because the way I was brought up, Catholic Church, they tried to do a lot of this.
Mhm.
Priests make, wear certain clothes, and during the so-called mass, if you want to call it, certain things would happen, the smoke and the bells and everything. It was kind of comical after you started reading the scriptures. You go, well, they never came close to what it says in the scriptures.
Well, it's it you know how close it is or isn't is kind of, I guess, a matter of opinion. It is I think drawn from this. It's inspired by this, and maybe not an exact replica, but they don't go up there with the bare head either. And they it's kind of they it's very interesting, I think, to see it, because they do have like the big red book that's the gospel. They have all these things, and it's the gospel that goes before them. So it's very ancient feeling, and you can see where maybe it was very powerful for people who couldn't read, and they needed more of a visual and otherwise a sensory experience when they came in, to know that, to really have a sense of worship. So, okay, any other thoughts? Does the robe that he's wearing, does that remind you a little bit of the final garment of Jesus? Finely woven without seams. It has the reinforced collar because it's such a nice garment. You don't want it to tear easy. You want it to last. I didn't look it up. I think these garments, whenever they became frayed just a little bit, they had to be burned and replaced. So they were supposed to have this attire on, and whenever they did their priestly duties, and it was a very important part of it. Um, any other thoughts on this? Okay, the holy to the Lord, or holy to Yahweh. This is, kind of their. It's a term basically, in a sense, for the priest as he's wearing it, but as the priest is also representing Israel. Israel is supposed to be holy to the Lord. They're supposed to be God's anointed. The priest is kind of a single person, and maybe an extreme example, but really representative of the people as a whole, and really the place where the people and God most precisely come together. And he's able to, we're going to see in the next chapter, which it looks like we're going to get to here in a little bit, um, the level of, before the priest can do any of these things, he has to himself be sanctified. He has to offer atoning sacrifices for himself before he can do these things. So it's, I think, a very uh, ornate, but also a very uh, visual, again, and kind of sensory um, designed service or worship practices. All of this stuff is designed, again, to reach people, have a sense of the importance, and these are, again, people that don't do the spiritual heavy lifting for themselves very much. It is the priest who's doing the work. It's not them coming, and each one is they're not really, in the religious context, in a sense, a nation of priests. They have a priest. Now they're supposed to be a nation, a royal priesthood as a people, but that's kind of more in their daily living and their example and interacting with the outside world, more than it is their religious practices. And again, if we consider some of this stuff, and by stuff I mean the Mosaic Law, the foundational statements, to have been, if not altered or not changed, but or expanded upon, but kind of rethought a little bit, re-explained, re-examined during their Babylonian captivity, where they don't have any political leaders. That kind of puts them right back where they're at here, isn't it? I mean, you have Moses, and he is a religious leader. He's not a priest, though. They don't have a king, though. They have a prophet leading them, and they have priests leading them. And they have, they're kind of back here, and they kind of build up the priesthood, lead, or let the priesthood effectively lead Israel going forward. It helps to understand the function, the priestly role, at a very high level, that they were taken with great reverence and very seriously. So it had an important part for them as the priest is serving as their leader. Yes, there was anointing. Yeah, we're going to talk more about the consecration of them, including the anointing, in the next couple of chapters. But yes, that was part of the process of them getting their act together, I guess you could say, before they could go out into the worship format. The kind of the last thing I want to leave it with is, in the New Testament, repeatedly, Jesus is presented as a greater manifestation of something from the Old Testament, or someone from the Old Testament. The Old Testament character is this, but Jesus is that. And that is always better than this. That is always greater than this. And the book of Hebrews in particular emphasizes the greatness of Jesus as a high priest compared to the high priests of Israel. And there's a lot of ways and a lot of bases for that. One of them is that these priests are priests because of the law of Moses, right? That's the only reason the tribe of Levi, the family of Aaron, that's the only reason they're priests, because God tells them that in the law of Moses. But Jesus is a high priest how? According to the book of Hebrews. He's the high priest of the order of Melchizedek. And that isn't to say Jesus is a descendant of Melchizedek. It is to say he's a priest the way Melchizedek was a priest. And we don't really know how or why or what occurred to make Melchizedek a priest. The lack of information we have about Melchizedek, in a sense, adds to his legend. It adds to his power in our minds, because there's nothing limiting his priesthood. There's no beginning to his priesthood. And since we don't know about his death, there's no end to his priesthood. My dad's a big fan. His dad turns 80 tomorrow. He's a big fan of the movie Jeremiah Johnson, the Mountain Man. And at the end of the movie, they say, some folks say he's up there still. And, the movie came out in the 70s, so he would have been probably about 140, 150 years old in the 70s. So he's like 200 years old now if he's still alive. But that's kind of the legend, the myth. Nobody knew he died, so maybe he's still up there. In Melchizedek's priesthood, since we don't know much about it, it has no beginning. It has no end. We don't know how or why he became a priest. It must have just been the will of God. He is a priesthood not dependent upon the law of Moses. It's great. His priesthood is greater than that. And Jesus is a priest in that sense as well. He's not of the tribe of Aaron, or Levi, is he? He's not descendant of Aaron. He's of the kingly tribe, Judah. He's a descendant of son of Jesse, son of David, the kingly tribe. But he is also our high priest. And one of the ways he is a greater high priest than the Hebrew high priest, the Aaronic high priests, is the Hebrew high priest had to atone for his own sins before he could atone for the sins of the people. Jesus didn't have to do that, did he? He had no sin for which to atone. So he offers his sacrifice is for himself. It's only him, and we're going to look about that a little bit closer in chapter 29. But that sacrifice is of Jesus is of himself and without being atoned. He didn't have to prepare in that sense. He didn't have to be atoned for before he offered his sacrifice, which was his own life, for the people of God. And certainly he was also holy to the Lord. The Romans, they gamble, don't they, for his robe, for his tunic, for his outer clothing, the last thing he owned, which was really nice, evidently. And they didn't want to just cut out swaths of fabric. They wanted to keep that intact, so they couldn't share it amongst themselves. So one person gets it, and everybody else is out. So, the Son of God is hanging on the cross, watching a bunch of filthy pagans gamble for his last article of clothing. How humiliating, I guess, in a sense. You can't really humiliate the humble, so I guess it's not humiliating, but how just the depravity of human conduct versus the holiness of God. The contrast really couldn't be more striking. And while you may see a lot of artwork portraying Jesus on the cross, and he's got some kind of loincloth, some kind of breeches on, that's not how they did it back then. The Romans, you got crucified, it was total humiliation. You were up there naked. They were not just killing you, they were making sport of you. They were degrading you in every way they could. So while the Jewish high priest, the Hebrew high priest, goes in with this very ornate set of clothing on, even stuff they don't normally wear, like underwear, Jesus' sacrifice, he goes before the Lord with nothing but what God gives everybody, what everybody starts out with. Which is absolutely nothing. I think I've told you all this before, but when I was a little kid, I learned that I was born naked. I was mortified. I said, no, I was not. I can't be born naked. I had clothes on when I was born. I don't go around naked. So, that's the birth. That's what they call it. I think that's how that came up. But I heard somebody say he's wearing his birthday suit. I said, Mom, what's a birthday suit? So, and that was the time I was way too young for it, but that was the time when streaking was a big thing on the college campuses and everything. So they were all there. Even had a song. Ray Stevens had a song about the streakers and everything. So they were running around in their birthday suits. But I don't know if they wore jogging shoes while they did that or not. But it's that's really the contrast is so great. And as we'll see, kind of going forward, particularly in terms of the sacrifices, how much of the heavy lifting of our relationship with God Jesus did, which is really all of it. If you go to Catholic Mass, if you go to an Orthodox Mass or whatever they call their service, the priests do almost all the work. They really put on a show. That's what they're doing. And the sermons, at least in the Catholic sense, are usually very short, like 5 or 10 minutes, a homily, what they call it. It's very brief. And everything else kind of really revolves around Eucharist. It revolves around the communion, their form of it. And I think in the Orthodox, at least the Greek Orthodox, I don't think that people maybe even take communion. I think the priest does everything for the people that are there. They stand there, they don't sit, they stand there, and the service is like 2 hours. And he does all the work. And we think standing there for 2 hours would be a lot of work, and it kind of would be. Boy, that'd get your sciatica going, wouldn't it? You got people that don't want to sit in an unpadded pew for 45 minutes. I don't either. I'm glad we got padded. Thank you to Carrie for our lovely, comfortable pews. But it's a the thing about Jesus is he does all of the heavy lifting, really. And what we do when we come together is not work. If we understand it as work, then we have had salvation by works. But if we come together to receive what Christ has given us, then it's not work. It's the reception of a gift. And our priesthood status is expressed outward when we go out of the building, when we leave the assembly, and embody what Christ did for us in our context for other people. Hopefully, while keeping our clothes on. But that's it's just the contrast. Again, we haven't brought this up in a while, but we've talked about it some. The old school people who say we need to go back to Old Testament ways, Old Testament judgment. And sometimes when you see the things you see on TV and the internet right now, you think maybe man, they didn't have all these things going on during those times. People got stoned to death outside the camp for doing what they're doing on Main Street these days. So you think, well, maybe it wouldn't be such a bad thing. But really, Christ changed everything. And yet we can see that he is the completion or the fulfillment, the exaltation, really, of the Mosaic Law, rather than a contradiction of it. So it's just an interesting, you see all of this elaborate clothing, all of these very nice items, tangible items that were made to facilitate Israel's worship, and how Jesus superseded. The altar upon which he is offered is the most simple thing you can possibly imagine. 2 wooden boards. That's all it is. Some nails nailing him down. I mean, that's another striking the elegance of design of the human body with the simplicity of human cruelty. Now you can take something that God creates that works so well and reflects his image and just nail it to an old board to kill it. So it's a very striking contrast, I think, in a way. And yet it's not exactly a contradiction. It is more of a completion or a fulfillment of it. Okay. Kind of watch our time here because we got off to a kind of an early start. We're okay. Let's go ahead and look at the first 9 verses of chapter 29. Exodus chapter 29. Now this is what you shall do to them, to consecrate them to minister as priests to me. Take 1 young bull and 2 rams without blemish, and unleavened bread and unleavened cakes mixed with oil, and unleavened wafers spread with oil. You shall make them of fine wheat flour. You shall put them in 1 basket, and present them in the basket along with the bull and the 2 rams. Then you shall bring Aaron and his sons to the doorway of the tent of meeting, and wash them with water. You shall take the garments and put on Aaron the tunic and the robe of the ephod and the breastpiece, and gird him with a skillfully woven band of the ephod. And you shall set the turban on his head, and put the holy crown on the turban. Then you shall take the anointing oil and pour it on his head and anoint him. You shall bring his sons and put the tunic on them. You shall gird them with sashes, Aaron and his sons, and bind caps on them. And they shall have the priesthood by a perpetual statute. So you shall ordain Aaron and his sons. What do you think about that?
we had to do some work.
There was a lot of animals involved. And this is just the beginning of it. There's a lot of animal sacrifice going on in Israel's worship. Um,
Now they specified what was done first.
mhm.
That's what I did out of it. You couldn't jump around one step by step by step.
You have to purify the priest before the priest can do anything for the people. So yes, this is all starting out. All of this is just to consecrate or ordain or install the priest. This is making them priests really to begin with. They haven't been formally named or created as priests yet. This is how this is going to happen. Now, as you see in your handouts, this is the first reception of the law by Moses, right? He's getting the tablets for the first time. He comes down the mountain with those tablets, and the holiday that is around that time, it's called the Feast of Weeks. It's also called Pentecost. So that's the first set of tablets. We're going to look at what happens much more closely later on. But what happens when Moses comes down from the mountaintop the first time? It's a mess, isn't it? And what happens to those tablets? He throws them down in anger. So that's what happens the first time. He goes back up. He chastises them, all this stuff and everything. He goes back up, gets the tablets again, comes back down. That is the day where they have atonement. And that atonement really is supposed to cover what happened while Moses was up on the mountain the first time. And the Jewish people today call that Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement. And so, just like the Feast of Weeks had an agricultural component to it that Israel hooks into their religious history with God, the Day of Atonement gets tied in. It's not just them taking this brand new priesthood, this brand new tabernacle, and this brand new, um, clothing and all that stuff, and dedicating it to the Lord. It has to do its function from the very beginning because of their sin. Aaron has to be atoned for. He's the one who makes the calf. So they have to start, from the very beginning. They have to locate these practices within their own history, within their own story. And that story is one of religious failure. It's one of not being the people God has called upon them to be. And again, this is a very striking contrast to their neighbors who all had their pagan gods, and they would dedicate their victories to their pagan gods. They had to be kind of worthy. You think about this atonement, the atonement doesn't really make you worthy. It just kind of takes away your unworthiness. It just deals with your failings. It's not a victory. It's God taking away your loss, in a sense. It's like it didn't happen. Versus, I did something great. So Israel has, from the very outset, a very different relationship with the true God than their neighbors have with their false gods. In every way, really. We talked when the clothing. You look at the breeches. It's kind of it's in your handouts, but the physical modesty that's required of the priest is a striking contrast to the religious ceremonies of a lot of the ancient pagan cultures, where you would have not just temple prostitutions, but nudity and more, maybe in the actual worship service. That's not supposed to be the way God's people worship Him. There's modesty required. A modesty is, to some extent, a cultural construct, isn't it? What is modest to us might have been very immodest to others. What was modest to them in antiquity might be immodest to us. If we saw a bunch of men come in dressed like Aaron, what would we think? They would stand out, wouldn't they? Right. They're wearing dresses. These are men wearing dresses. So if you get mad when you see somebody wearing sandals to church, well, Jesus would never wear sandals to church. He wore sandals all the time. They had to wash their feet before they took the Lord's. He washed their feet. They took the Lord's Supper. So it's modesty is a something is a being modest is a, first of all, it's a descriptive term. It's a relative term. I mean, we could all be wearing full burqas, not even showing our faces, top to bottom, and that would be obscuring everything, right? I don't know that in our context, isolated individuals wearing burqas is particularly modest. It certainly draws a lot of attention to them, especially at the airport, right? But uh, it covers everything, doesn't it? Yes, sir. In our context, it is. In their context, where they come from originally, so that's all to say. Terms like women can't have short hair. Well, what's short? That's a relative term, isn't it? Men can't have long hair. What's long? I remember when the Beatles, not that I was around, but when the Beatles first came out, they had those mop top kind of thing going on there. And everybody thought, look at those long haired hippies in the early 60s. How was their hair 10 years later? Well, I'll show you some long hair. You think that's long? It's going to get longer. So all of these terms are kind of relative, and they fit in with the culture. Long compared to short compared to what people normally do and wear. So all of these ideas are somewhat fitted in with culture. And the Jewish culture was supposed to be different than their neighbors. And in many ways it was. In some ways they probably failed to do that. But that was the whole purpose of these laws, is to draw a distinction between them and their neighbors, between the holy and the unholy, or the profane, the common. Um, some of these, the washing, of course, has a significance to us, and as it sets the stage maybe for baptism down the road. Even anointing is a big deal for Christians. Jesus is the Messiah. He is the anointed one. The kings were anointed, along with the priests later on. Um, so all of these things kind of have certainly had an impact on Christian thought as much as they were Hebrew thought, Hebrew practice. To be ordained is to fill the hand. When you ordain someone, is to fill the hand. So it can be called ordained, or it can be maybe installed. So they're kind of equipped. They're called for a purpose, and they are equipped to do that purpose. And it's not a one-time thing. The full ordination is for 7 days, and even during the 7 days, it has to be renewed during the week. So really, no one person can do all of these things all the time. You have to have, becomes a teamwork, a team group of priests, not just one priest, but you do always have a high priest. Oh, yes, ma'am.
does the crown and the turban soak it up, or does it get the whole garment wet?
There's a that's an interesting point. The kind of general thought is that it was a relatively restrained anointing on Aaron. That's the thought. Psalm 133, which is a psalm extolling the greatness of brotherly unity, talks about the oil seeking. So I mean, it's an extravagant anointing. I mean, it soaks Aaron. It soaks into his hair, soaks through the hat. He's got that big ZZ Top beard, coming down. It soaks that beard. It soaks his clothes. It drips onto the ground. And that may not have been how they normally did it, but it's a sign in the psalm. It's in the context of God pouring out, and I think that's when we talk about unity, a lot of times we talk about what we have to do to be unified. Somebody has to give up on something or whatever. You have to make the sacrifice, and it's always the other person that needs to make it so you can be unified with them, right? But in Psalm 133, unity is a gift from God. It's a miracle performed by God. The oil comes from God, right? Because the anointing oil, as we'll see in chapter 30, is not just oil. There's a lot of very expensive things in there. And they have those because God gave it to them. The other thing that unity is compared to is the dew on the mountain. Where does the dew come from? It comes from evening and morning. Temperature change from night into day. You get condensation. That's dew. What is dew? It's water. God says unity is oil and water. How unified are oil and water naturally? What happens when you make your own salad dressing at home with oil and vinegar? Vinegar is almost completely water. They don't stay together, do they? You have to. What do you have to do to bring them together? Usually, if you want to keep them together, you got to have a binder, right? Like put mustard in there or something that can hold on to oil and hold on to water. What's our binder? Jesus, who can hold on to God and humanity. And you have to agitate it. Somebody has to shake it up in order for it to be unified. I think what's going on right now in the world should agitate the church. It should shake us up. Make us not cling to our own preferences all the time, but make us cling to Christ. Because all of these problems in the world, in some way, shape, form, or fashion, they are manifestations of our own failings. And they're manifestations of a humanity that's not connected to God through Jesus Christ. And maybe people have always thought that and always said that. It's the things that are happening right now on public streets would not have happened on any public street anywhere I grew up as a kid. I mean, if it happened, you were going to jail. You were going to be there for a while. They would give you something to wear. It would be bright orange and it would cover everything. And they knew which jail to put you in, too. It didn't matter which jail you wanted to go to. It was the jail they were going to put you in. So the world has changed a lot. But so this anointment, this is a prerequisite before Aaron can serve as priest. And this is just really the very beginning. This is God is saying, this is what you do. And then the rest of the chapter is really how you do it. This is how the ordination or consecration, the sanctification, and whatever you want to call it, of the priests occur. That this is how you make it happen, and ultimately, it very much inspires the rest of Jewish worship. In fact, the daily sacrifices become really the hallmark of the faith of Jewish faith when Jesus is on earth, rather than so much pointing towards just simply the Day of Atonement. Yes, sir.
Question on that. What's that? Put the turban on his head. The turban is a really bad, well, you should, they have a turban.
It would have been wrapped around his head, yes.
Probably blind or like, because we don't, well, I don't think of it. I see a turban. And I don't see it, it's not almost quality, it's amazing. That person doing something weird, odd, they're trying to hear it.
It was required. It was part of the garment. Not you didn't go in with a bare head, and you did go in with bare feet, but you had breeches on. So I mean, it was.
Because of society, that era, turban is worn by other.
It is part of. They have the high priest has that plaque or crown, as it's sometimes called. It says "Holy to the Lord," and that kind of cinches up the turban, and then the sash cinches up all the other articles of clothing. Kind of gird your loins, tighten up your belt, and so it fits the whole thing together. It is, and as we'll see as we get deeper into chapter 29 here, they were ordained and consecrated head to toe. And they get a blood drop on their earlobe, on their right thumb, and on their right big toe. So they are head to toe sanctified for their purpose. We'll look at that more next week. Okay. I don't know if your lovely bride told you, Mr. Waite, but you're leading our closing prayer.